At 11:47 on the night of May 13th, three cardinals stepped out of a locked room inside the Apostolic Palace, and none of them looked at the Swiss guard standing outside. Their hands were shaking, their faces had lost their color, and one of them appeared close to collapse. Behind the heavy wooden door, Pope Leo XIV remained alone at a long oak table, his glasses folded beside a leather folder containing 17 pages that could force the Catholic Church to confront its own system of power. The document carried no title and no Vatican seal, but its proposal reached further than any financial reform Leo had attempted during his first year. It would place bishops, cardinals, and even decisions of the papal office under independent civilian scrutiny, with findings that could be published without Vatican approval. Three of the most powerful men in the room refused to accept it, and when they walked out, they did not promise cooperation, silence, or restraint. The Church had not split, but the fault line was already visible. On one side stood a pope who believed the institution could survive only by exposing its failures. On the other stood experienced cardinals who believed that accountability imposed from outside could destroy the authority they were trying to protect. What happened inside that room did not remain there. Within days, alliances shifted, 17 cardinals were contacted, international news organizations began reporting a Vatican crisis, and Leo released the first page of the document himself. Subscribe to the channel now, because this story begins with 3 shaking cardinals, but it ends with 16 unreleased pages and a question that could determine whether the Church faces its reckoning together or is torn apart by it. 5 days earlier, on May 8th, the atmosphere inside the Vatican had carried none of the ease expected from an anniversary. Exactly 1 year had passed since Robert Francis Prevost stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and took the name Pope Leo XIV. During that first year, he had moved with a speed that unsettled men accustomed to measuring change in decades. He restructured the oversight board of the Vatican Bank and removed 2 bishops accused of concealing financial misconduct in their dioceses. He also opened an independent audit of spending across every Vatican department, reaching back 15 years. Each decision was delivered in the same calm tone, without spectacle or warning, and that restraint made his opponents more nervous because they could not predict where the next intervention would fall. By the time the anniversary arrived, the College of Cardinals had divided into 3 recognizable factions. The first supported Leo without hesitation and believed the reforms were overdue. The second resisted through delays, private conversations, and careful obstruction, while avoiding any public confrontation that could expose the depth of their opposition. The third faction held the balance. These cardinals respected Leo personally and accepted that the Church faced serious failures, but they feared that his pace could provoke a crisis larger than the reforms themselves. Leo had watched all 3 groups form, and by the morning of May 9th, he had decided that waiting would only allow the division to harden. Leo did not call a synod or summon the full College of Cardinals. He selected 9 men and women, 3 from each faction, for a private session on the night of May 13th. The meeting would take place inside a room in the Apostolic Palace that had not been used for formal proceedings in more than 30 years. The room carried its own history. It had once been used for disciplinary proceedings against members of the clergy, and its selection immediately gave the invitation a weight that no written agenda could have supplied. There would be no staff, no secretaries, and no recording devices inside, only the Pope and the 9 cardinals he had chosen. The invitations were not sent through electronic mail or delivered by the ordinary Vatican courier system. A single Jesuit priest, who had served as Leo's personal aide since before the conclave, carried them by hand. Each recipient received a plain envelope containing one card with the date, the time, and a room number. There was no explanation of purpose and no indication of what the cardinals were expected to bring. The absence of information was deliberate, and within hours it began producing the effect Leo had anticipated. The 9 invitees started contacting one another, not to clarify the agenda, but to determine who else had been summoned and what kind of confrontation might be waiting behind that closed door. Cardinal Gerhard Müller of Munich was the first to receive his invitation. He was 71 years old, deeply conservative, and one of the most vocal critics of Leo's financial reforms. He had already described the Vatican bank audit as an act of institutional self-harm, and the plain card in his hand gave him no reason to believe the coming meeting would be conciliatory. Müller immediately called Cardinal Pietro Valenti in Rome, the 68-year-old Italian who had become the unofficial leader of the opposition faction. Their conversation lasted 11 minutes. Neither man later disclosed what was said, but people close to Valenti confirmed that both cardinals agreed to attend and to bring what they called a unified position. That phrase began moving quietly through the opposition before anyone knew what Leo intended to place before them. It suggested that the meeting would not begin with 9 independent judgments, but with at least 2 men already committed to speaking as a bloc. Before the first chair was occupied, one side had started preparing for resistance. Cardinal Ana Maria Rodriguez Soto received her invitation on May 10th. At 59, the Archbishop of Lima was among the youngest members of the College of Cardinals and one of Leo's strongest allies in the financial transparency campaign. After piecing together part of the guest list through private conversations, she told a close colleague that Leo was not looking for consensus, but for commitment. The days before the meeting carried an urgency that Vatican officials found unusual even by the standards of the Holy See. Disputes inside the Church normally moved through committees, revised documents, and years of delay. This invitation offered none of those protective layers, and the disciplinary history of the chosen room made the silence around it feel deliberate. Rumors spread through offices and corridors almost immediately. Some officials believed Leo would demand resignations, while others expected a new encyclical that would remove power from the Roman Curia. A third theory claimed that the Pope had evidence of coordinated obstruction by conservative cardinals and intended to place them on trial. None of the rumors identified the full proposal, but each one touched part of the pressure that had brought the 9 cardinals together. By May 13th, junior staff were watching doors, schedules, and private movements more carefully than usual. The palace had not announced a gathering, yet its internal rhythm had already changed. The 9 cardinals entered the Apostolic Palace through 3 separate entrances over a period of 2 hours. Their arrivals were staggered to avoid attention, but Vatican journalists noticed the unusual movement, and by 8 in the evening at least 2 reporters had confirmed that something was happening inside. They knew neither the room nor the purpose, but they knew senior figures were moving under conditions designed to conceal a meeting. At 9:15, the door closed. A single Swiss guard, personally selected by Leo, took his position outside and received one instruction. No one would enter, no one would leave, and no information would pass through the door until the meeting ended. Inside, 10 chairs waited around a long oak table, with water on the surface and no wine. Leo sat at the head of the table in a simple white cassock, rather than formal papal vestments. His glasses rested beside a leather folder, and he waited until all 9 cardinals were seated before speaking. When he finally began, his voice was controlled and direct. He had not called them there to negotiate, but because the Church was lying to its people. Cardinal Weiss shifted in his chair. Cardinal Valenti folded his hands and Cardinal Rodriguez Soto kept her eyes fixed on the Pope. Leo opened the folder and removed a document printed on plain paper. It was 17 pages long, carried no title, and contained what he called the full accounting. The document had been assembled with the help of a small investigative team working quietly for 8 months. It covered institutional failures across 23 dioceses in 14 countries. The record included financial misconduct, misappropriated funds, undisclosed investments, and payments made to silence accusers. The evidence moved beyond money. Complaints had been received, documented, and deliberately buried, while bishops warned about dangerous clergy had answered with transfers instead of action. The cases extended across 3 decades and 4 papacies, turning what might have appeared isolated into something systematic. Leo presented the findings page by page without raising his voice. He named dioceses, cited dates, and referred to documents recovered from Vatican archives after being classified, misfiled, or physically removed from their proper locations. The room did not need anger because the evidence was already doing the work. By page 7, Cardinal Weiss interrupted. He argued that the failures were not new and that the Church had already addressed them through existing procedures. Leo stopped him before he could finish and said that general acknowledgement was no longer enough. The document contained names, dates, amounts, and outcomes. Leo said it did not describe scattered failures, but a protected pattern built into the institution itself. The room changed because the accusation was no longer directed at individual weakness, but at a system maintained by design. Cardinal Valenti asked what Leo was proposing. The Pope turned to page 14, where the findings gave way to a structural response. He called for the creation of an independent oversight body staffed outside the clergy and controlled neither by the Vatican nor by canon law. The civilian board would hold investigative authority inside church institutions and would be able to publish its conclusions without Vatican approval. Its jurisdiction would include financial misconduct, administrative cover-ups, and failures of accountability at every level of the hierarchy. Then Leo reached the line that transformed the meeting from an internal debate into a direct challenge to the existing order. The board would also examine the actions of cardinals and the decisions of the papal office itself. Leo was proposing that even the Pope should be subject to external accountability. Cardinal Weiss rose from his chair and declared that the plan was not reform, but the dismantling of ecclesial authority. Leo looked at Cardinal Weiss without blinking and ordered him to sit down. Weiss obeyed, but the argument had already exposed the central fear in the room. To the opposition, the proposal did not merely change procedure. It transferred judgment over the Church to a body outside the authority the Church had guarded for centuries. Leo answered that he was not dismantling authority, but ending a system in which the institution investigated itself, judged itself, and then forgave itself. For generations, the faithful had been asked to entrust their children, their money, and their belief to the Church. When that trust was broken, internal protection had too often taken priority over public accountability. Cardinal Thomas Okoro of Lagos leaned forward from the undecided side of the table. He accepted the principle behind the reform, but warned that a civilian body with authority over church institutions would be interpreted as a surrender of sovereignty. Governments and political movements could use the precedent to demand influence over religious institutions far beyond the cases contained in Leo's document. Leo rejected that calculation. Political consequences, he said, could not outweigh the moral consequences of continued concealment. He would not lead a church that used sovereignty as a shield against accountability. The debate continued for hours as the 9 cardinals challenged the proposal from different positions. Weiss, Valenti, and Cardinal Jean-Luc Moreau of Paris formed a bloc of absolute resistance, arguing that the plan threatened religious autonomy and could strengthen anti-Catholic movements in Europe and North America. Rodriguez Soto and Cardinal Priya Sharma of Mumbai supported the reform, while Okoro moved from caution toward Leo's side. The remaining undecided cardinals did not move together. Cardinal Hans Breitner of Vienna began leaning toward support. Cardinal Francisco Delgado of Manila pressed Leo on implementation and legal structure, and Cardinal Robert Owusu of Accra spoke little while listening with visible intensity. The room was no longer divided into the same three groups that had entered it. At the turning point of the meeting, Leo closed the leather folder and removed his glasses. He addressed Valenti by his first name, a familiarity he rarely used in formal settings, and told him that he understood the opposition was rooted in a desire to protect the Church. Then he made clear that protection could no longer depend on silence. Leo said he possessed enough evidence to release the entire document publicly. Every page, every name, and every institutional failure could be placed before the world. He insisted that this was not a threat, but a statement of what would happen if the Church refused to confront the truth through reform. The truth, he said, would emerge through reform or through scandal. He preferred reform, but the evidence would not remain contained simply because powerful men considered disclosure dangerous. Valenti held his gaze before asking whether Leo was prepared to expose the Church to its enemies. Leo answered that the Church's immediate enemy was its own silence. No voice rose after that response, but the positions in the room hardened. Valenti, Weiss, and Moreau would not accept the proposed framework, and they would not give Leo the commitment he had demanded. When the three cardinals left the room, the Swiss guard outside saw their shaking hands and pale faces. They had offered no promise of cooperation, and no promise that the conflict would remain contained. The meeting had ended, but the opposition had already become a campaign. Within 48 hours, the conservative faction had begun to mobilize through the network of relationships connecting the College of Cardinals across continents. Valenti contacted 17 cardinals who had not attended the meeting and described Leo's proposal as an existential threat to the independence of the Church. He warned that accepting external authority over internal governance would create a precedent governments could use against religious institutions around the world. Cardinal Weiss chose a different path. On May 15th, he flew to Munich and began drafting a formal theological objection grounded in ecclesiology, arguing that the Church could not submit its internal structure to an external human authority without contradicting its own nature. The argument gave hesitant cardinals a way to oppose Leo without appearing to defend financial misconduct or administrative concealment. Cardinal Jean-Luc Moreau worked through Catholic media. He did not disclose the meeting, but he gave interviews warning against the importation of secular governance models into sacred institutions. The language remained general, yet the target was clear to anyone who understood the conflict moving beneath the public surface. Leo knew the opposition was organizing. During his first year, he had built quiet alliances not only among cardinals, but among monsignors, department heads, and archivists, who understood how information moved through the Vatican. Many of them had watched the institution protect itself at the expense of the faithful, and they now gave Leo a clearer view of the campaign forming against him. On May 15th, Leo met privately with Cardinal Francisco Delgado, the undecided cardinal from Manila, who had pressed him hardest on implementation. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When Delgado left, he was no longer undecided. What Leo showed him was not fully confirmed, but sources close to both men said it included additional evidence beyond the 17-page document. The material concerned financial irregularities in dioceses connected to the conservative faction, though it did not accuse Weiss or Valenti of personal corruption. Leo did not offer silence in exchange for support. He showed Delgado the scale of the institutional danger and allowed the evidence to make the decision unavoidable. By May 16th, the balance inside the College of Cardinals had become measurable. Roughly 40% supported Leo's proposal in some form, roughly 30% opposed it, and the remaining 30% continued to wait. The conflict had not yet broken into public view, but the institution was no longer moving as one body. That evening, Vatican journalist Cristina Ferrara published a carefully worded report on her independent Catholic news site. The headline referred only to internal tensions among senior cardinals over governance reform, but the article confirmed that a serious division existed. Within hours, major international news organizations repeated the story and placed Pope Leo XIV at the center of a Vatican crisis. Leo gave no public interview and issued no defensive statement. On the morning of May 17th, he ordered the official communications office to release page 1 of the document. It was presented not as a leak, but as a deliberate act of transparency. The page named no cardinal, bishop, or diocese. It contained only a statistical summary covering a 10-year period, including the number of formal complaints received, the number fully investigated, and the number that produced disciplinary action. Out of more than 4,000 complaints, fewer than 300 had been fully investigated, and fewer than 90 had resulted in action. The figures moved through Catholic media and social platforms within hours. Supporters of reform treated them as proof that the existing system had failed, while opponents argued that the numbers lacked context and included unsubstantiated complaints. None of those arguments could remove the fact that the Pope himself had placed the numbers before the public. Valenti called Leo that morning and accused him of breaking trust. Leo answered that he had told the truth, and when Valenti warned that the release would be seen as an attack on the institution, Leo said it was an attack on the institution's failures. The exchange ended with Valenti warning that the opposition was considering formal canonical mechanisms that might constrain the Pope's ability to impose structural change without broader consent. The mechanisms were obscure, untested, and legally disputed, but invoking them would carry its own message. A substantial minority of the Church's senior leadership was prepared to challenge the authority of the Pope. Leo did not retreat, and he told Valenti to do what he believed necessary, while Leo did what he believed right. By the afternoon of May 17th, the Catholic Church had entered a confrontation unlike anything it had faced in modern history. A sitting pope had released evidence of institutional failure. A significant minority of cardinals was considering formal resistance, and the global press was watching every movement inside the Vatican. Somewhere in the Apostolic Palace, 16 unreleased pages remained inside the leather folder. Leo gave no indication of when the remaining pages would appear. His opponents had not yet filed a canonical challenge, and the undecided cardinals continued to weigh two outcomes they considered equally dangerous. They could support a pope whose methods felt too aggressive, or they could resist a reform whose necessity they could no longer deny. Later that day in Lima, Cardinal Ana Maria Rodriguez Soto spoke to a small group of clergy. She said every institution eventually reaches a moment when it must decide whether it values its own survival more than the people it was created to serve. The Church, she told them, had reached that moment, and it now had a pope who was not afraid of the answer. That evening, Leo walked alone through the Vatican gardens, with his hands clasped behind his back. For nearly an hour, he followed the same path around the fountain near the Lord's grotto, moving slowly while the struggle he had forced into public view spread beyond the walls. When he finally turned toward the entrance, a groundskeeper, standing at a distance, tried to remain unnoticed. Leo stopped and remarked that it was a beautiful night. The groundskeeper agreed, and the Pope nodded before stepping toward the open door. Then Leo said that truth was patient, that it always waited, but that it never left. The door closed behind him. The leather folder remained inside the apostolic palace, with 16 pages still unreleased, and every page more detailed than the one already given to the world. The Church had not split, but the fault line now ran openly through an institution that had endured for 2,000 years. On one side stood a pope who believed survival required honesty regardless of the cost. On the other stood cardinals who believed that honesty imposed through this mechanism could become the cost the Church could not survive. Both sides believed they were defending the faithful, and both understood that the next move could reshape the authority of the papacy for generations. The Swiss guard who stood outside the meeting room was later reassigned. He never submitted a formal report, but he told a fellow guard that the most disturbing detail was not the trembling hands or the pale faces of the cardinals. It was the sound that passed through the heavy wooden door immediately before they emerged. There was no shouting. There were no final arguments and no movement loud enough to reach the corridor. After hours of confrontation, the last sound was complete silence, as though every word had already been spoken and only the consequences remained. Those consequences are still unfolding. The pages remain, the battle lines remain, and Pope Leo XIV remains calm, deliberate, and prepared to act. The question is no longer whether the Church will face its reckoning, but whether it will face that reckoning together or be torn apart by it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next decision from Leo or his opponents may determine not only the future of this conflict, but how more than 1 billion Catholics understand the institution they still call their Church.